A beautiful couple thrives in Atlanta's hip-hop scene.
He was a performing rap artist.
He was gaining some traction in the streets of Atlanta. She was very attracted to that exciting lifestyle.
She fell in love with him.
But when one of these lovebirds is found clinging to life, evil secrets are revealed.
She was trying to tell her something, but she couldn't really make out what she was trying to say to her.
Investigators can immediately tell this was no random intruder.
She does notice that the door is unlocked, and this gives her a sinking feeling in her stomach.
Whoever committed the crime was led in voluntarily.
But tracking down the killer will be easier said than done.
What do you mean he's gone?
How did he just do this and leave?
He had been on the run for 3.5 years.
The Mexican authorities got involved.
And everything was just a roller coaster.
2014. It's just before morning twilight in the Atlanta bedroom community of Venetian Hills.
Venetian Hills is an urban environment, predominantly hard-working, middle-class community. It serves as a very good place for persons who work within the city.
But just after 3 a.m., as many residents are getting their last moments of sleep, the quiet night is interrupted by a harrowing 911 call.
I need ambulance, please. I'm supposed to be inside.
Okay, is she awake?
No.
She frantically begs them to get there quick because her sister is dying.
Okay, you say she's unconscious? Okay, breathing.
The caller, LaToya Jackson, provides the address of her mother's apartment where she and her sister Rashawn had been staying the night.
Atlanta police officers and emergency medical technicians rushed to the mother's apartment.
When they arrive, first responders find Rashawn unresponsive on the floor, surrounded by her devastated mother and sister.
We can do everything we can do.
Responding officers started immediately providing rescue techniques. And it's critical because every second counts when it comes to trying to save someone's life.
As Rashawn's life hangs in the balance, her family is left wondering what evil has infiltrated their home and why was Rashawn the target? Born and raised in Atlanta, 34-year-old Rashawn Jackson was always known for her kind and generous spirit.
People really loved her and gravitated toward her. She was a very devoted daughter, a very loving aunt.
She liked going shopping, buying gifts for her nieces and nephews. She loved every last person that she's around. She's just that type of person.
Rashawn also understood the value of hard work.
She was a manager at a popular Atlanta restaurant.
She was a good employee. You know, she would work all the time, very dependable, very trustworthy.
The first time I met Rashawn, I just started working at the Chick-fil-A Dorf House, and she was a leader there. She's very outspoken. She loved to teach, so I can go to her about anything. She's very easy to talk to. She was funny at times, and I just loved being around her.
Even with all her success, Rashawn dreamed of having someone to share it with.
Rashawn was also very optimistic about love. She wanted to find someone that she could share life with.
And when Rashawn met a man named Maurice Nesbitt in 2009, it seemed as though she'd finally found her match.
Excuse me, how you doing? I know you're not leaving already.
They initially met at a club. He approached her.
Yeah, I actually got to get up early in the morning for work.
What's your name?
It's Rashawn.
Rashawn, I'm Maurice. It's nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too.
Rashawn was intrigued by Maurice's bold personality and charming demeanor.
On his mother's side, he was Hispanic. His mom still resided in Mexico, and Maurice was actually bilingual.
He was good looking, he was charismatic, and she was drawn to all of those things about him.
Can I trouble you for one more dance before you do?
Okay, just one?
Just one.
Instead of catching her ride home, Rashawn decided to head back upstairs with Maurice and never looked back.
They ended up dancing the night away. After that, Rashawn was smitten.
They got to know each other, they started dating.
She was drawn to his character, his personality, the way he made her feel.
But Maurice wasn't just charming. He was also talented.
Maurice was an up-and-coming rapper. He had some popularity in the city of Atlanta.
He went by the name of Mega Ruckus.
He had some videos that he put out, and he was gaining some traction.
He even had a video with Young Thug, who was rising in his popularity in Atlanta at the time. He was moving in those circles.
The Atlanta rap scene is kind of the mecca for rappers trying to make it in the South. Maurice made lots of music videos showing off cars, money, jewelry.
It really appeared as though Maurice's music career was going to take off, and Rashawn was very attracted to that exciting lifestyle.
As far as Rashawn was concerned, Maurice was someone with a bright future ahead of him.
She was crazy about him.
The couple were head over heels in love, and they were making plans to move in together.
But now, instead of moving in with the man she loved, Rashawn has been shot inside her mother's apartment and left clinging to life.
It was quickly determined that the victim had been shot in the head, point blank.
Initially, you can see with the contact wound to the head that it was not likely that she would survive.
Pulse is gone.
Unfortunately, with all their efforts to save her life, it was too late. Rashawn Jackson is dead.
"34-year-old restaurant manager Rashawn Jackson had fallen head over heels for up-and-coming Atlanta rapper Maurice Nesbitt, a.k.a. Mega Ruckus.
She saw him as someone that she could really spend her life with and have a serious relationship with.
She loved his creativity and his passion for his music. It seemed like his career was getting ready to take off.
But now, Rashawn is lying in a pool of blood with a fatal gunshot wound.
Paramedics attempted to provide first aid, but the victim had been shot in the head, point blank.
Pulse is gone.
Unfortunately, with all their efforts to save her life, it was too late. Rashawn Jackson is dead.
Officers give the devastating news to Rashawn's mother and sister.
Rashawn's mother was beside herself.
The family was just too distraught to even communicate with police officers at that time.
In an effort to get a more cohesive and coherent statement and give them time to calm down, they did have to take them down to the police precinct.
As Rashawn's family continues to process the tragedy, detectives arrive to begin processing the crime scene.
Her body was in between the bed and the closet.
It seems Rashawn was caught off guard by her killer. There's a pool of blood under Rashawn's head, as well as blood splatter leading into the direction of the closet.
Around the room, detectives locate more potential clues.
We see some cigarettes in the room. We see a couple of beer cans.
These items were collected and sent off to the crime lab in hopes that they would find DNA evidence.
Investigators also find ballistic evidence that they can try to tie back to the murder weapon.
The investigators find a 9mm shell casing, which is collected and sent off to ballistic analysis.
Outside of Rashawn's bedroom, the rest of the apartment appears to be undisturbed.
When investigators checked the entirety of the house, they found that there's no evidence of forced entry. The house had not been ransacked. There was a period that no items were missing.
It seems more like whoever killed Rashawn was either let into the apartment or had a key of their own.
This must have been someone Rashawn knew.
Hoping to get an idea of who that person might be, officers begin a canvass of the apartment complex.
Officers began door to door, canvassing of the neighborhood.
But while several neighbors heard the gunshot, none of them saw the person who fired the gun.
Without a visual description, homicide detectives had very little to go on.
Until they meet with the apartment complex's leasing manager.
Detectives discovered that there are cameras located on the property that could provide some surveillance video.
All right. Here's the parking lot just before 3 a.m.
He shows detectives the footage, and they can see a white car pulling up around 2:41 a.m.
The vehicle parks just a few yards away from the Jacksons' front door, and a shadowy figure exits.
You see him get out of his car, you can see him walk in the apartment.
For the next few minutes, there's no other activity on the video.
He stayed in there for probably 30 minutes to 45 minutes.
At that point, he can be seen exiting the apartment, entering his vehicle, and speeding away.
As they continue to watch the video, minutes later, they could see emergency vehicles arriving on the scene to attend to Rashawn.
Radio, we have a confirmation on suspect vehicles.
Detectives believe this is no coincidence.
Detectives are certain that this man has to be Rashawn's killer.
Police in Atlanta, Georgia are investigating the homicide of Rashawn Jackson after the 34-year-old restaurant manager was shot dead in the middle of the night.
In this once quiet neighborhood of Venetian Hills, the people are just fearful. If something like this could happen to Rashawn, what about the rest of them?
But detectives have a hunch this was a targeted attack. And now they've discovered surveillance video of Rashawn's suspected killer leaving the crime scene.
It definitely looked like he was in a hurry to get out of there.
While the video is compelling evidence, it's not a slam dunk for investigators.
It does not provide a clear view of the suspect's face, nor the tag number on the vehicle. The video surveillance is just too grainy to make out clear details.
Still, they radioed to police in the area with a description of the car.
The detective issued an all-points bulletin to be on the lookout for that vehicle. The white sedan.
News of Rashawn's death soon spreads throughout the greater Atlanta area.
When I first heard of Rashawn's passing, I was on my way to work at that moment where we worked together. Once I found out I couldn't work the rest of the day, a few of us couldn't work the rest of the day. So it was the hardest news.
Meanwhile, detectives head back to the station to speak with Rashawn's grieving mother and sister.
They started trying to figure out what happened. What did they hear? What did they see? Who could have done this to Rashawn?
Rashawn's loved ones are still overwhelmed by everything that's happened.
They are absolutely distraught, but they want to see justice served.
Detectives start the interview by asking the family members to slowly walk them through everything that happened that night.
I'm so sorry for your loss. We're gonna get to the bottom of this.
Can you please tell us everything you remember about what happened?
Yes, well, it was a normal evening.
Rashawn's family tells detectives that yesterday was just like another day. Nothing stuck out of the ordinary about Rashawn's activity or her behavior.
They were at her mother's home, and Rashawn had came home from work, and they were all just hanging out for a little while.
They all went to bed around 11 p.m.
LaToya says she distinctly remembers locking the front door before turning in for the night.
She told the police that she locked the door, and she went upstairs and she laid in the bed with her mom and fell asleep.
I'm a heavy sleeper, so I didn't hear the gunshot go off, but it woke Mama up.
That's right.
Around 3 a.m., Miss Jackson was awakened by a loud pop.
I tried to find the source of the noise.
It startles her, so she gets up out of her bed and moves towards the sound.
Miss Jackson says she walked into the living room and didn't see anything unusual. However, she did hear a car start outside.
She hears the sound of tires screeching.
At this point, she looks out the window and doesn't see the car. But she does notice the door is unlocked, and this gives her a sinking feeling in her stomach.
Rashawn? Rashawn!
Concerned, Rashawn's mother went to check on her.
She called out to Rashawn, and there was no answer.
When she opened the bedroom door, she saw Rashawn lying on the floor near her closet.
She was unsure of what exactly was going on, but as she approached her daughter, she saw the blood.
Rashawn! Oh, my baby! Latoya!
Rashawn's sister runs in the room. She goes to assist her sister, and her sister's barely breathing.
What happened? I don't know!
Miss Jackson tells detectives that for a moment, Rashawn was still conscious and trying to say something.
Oh, come on, baby. Come on, baby. We're here.
She tries to, talk to her, say like, don't die, stay awake. And she says Rashawn is trying to speak to her.
She's trying to say something to her, but she can't get the words out. So at this point, Rashawn's sister grabs the phone to dial 911.
I need ambulance, please. My sister is sad.
Rashawn's mother says she held her daughter in her arms until first responders arrived.
She said she was trying to feel for her heartbeat, but by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late.
Her daughter basically died in her arms.
Did you hear anyone else inside of the home? Was Rashawn fighting with anyone?
Not at all.
There is no statements from her mother or sister that they heard any type of arguing or anything like that. All we knew was there was a gunshot.
It's a horrifying story, and investigators offer their condolences for the family's loss.
But they also have an important question they're hoping the family will be able to answer.
They were asking them who could have done this to her.
The two women immediately give the same answer.
There's only one person that they could think of.
They told him, basically, that the only person that could have done it was Maurice Nesbitt.
Police in Atlanta have just heard a harrowing account from Rashawn Jackson's mother about her daughter dying in her arms after suffering a fatal gunshot wound from an apparent intruder.
There was nothing more that she could do, and the pain and the devastation that she felt in that moment as the life left her daughter's body, she would never be the same again.
Based on evidence at the Jackson home, it seems that Rashawn Jackson opened the door for her killer, and her loved ones have a strong suspect.
They told him, basically, that the only person that could have done it was Maurice Nesbitt.
When Rashawn met Maurice in 2009, she was instantly infatuated with him. He possessed this larger-than-life rapper persona, and she was mesmerized by that.
He sold her a pipe dream that she could have it all with him, and she wanted to believe it.
It didn't take long, though, before Rashawn's family started to notice a change in her.
She changed when she was with him. She wasn't the same anymore.
Her mood turned dark, and she began not to be the bubbly person that they knew.
And I think that's when her family started to become suspicious of what was happening.
I never liked him.
Rashawn's mother definitely did not approve of Maurice. When Maurice came around, it was kind of a different energy that did not need to be in her house at that time.
Rashawn's mother says when she first heard Maurice rapping under his mega ruckus persona, She was shocked by how crude his lyrics were.
His songs were about violence, guns, and his lyrics were very demeaning towards women.
I expressed my concerns to Rashawn, but she just brushed it off.
When he talked to Rashawn about it, she said he only rapped about those things, and that's not who he was in real life.
But before long, the family noticed other telltale signs that something was horribly wrong.
They began to notice marks on Rashawn's body. And when they asked her about it, she would make excuses as though she fell or bumped into something.
And it was unlike her to lie to us, but we could tell that she was covering up for him.
They believed that Maurice had begun abusing her.
And according to the family, the abuse wasn't only physical.
He was taking her hard-earned money from her.
I'm gonna need another 1K for this video.
Maurice did not have a steady income. He would definitely come to Rashawn for money if he needed it, whether it be for music or whenever he asked for it. Rashawn was being used.
Baby, are you sure? I mean, we've already spent a lot.
I know, baby, but I promise when this video pop off, it's gonna make a difference for the both of us.
He made promises to Rashawn. You know, he promised her that they would move in together, that they would be a family, and she took those to heart. And she would actually give him some of her checks in an effort to show him how much she loved him.
Thank you, baby. This new video gonna be fire.
Well, you know I'm your biggest fan.
I only heard maybe 1 or 2 songs. They were not hit makers to me.
I think he was making his life or trying to appear more grandiose than it actually was. No one was really buying what he was selling, so his career didn't take off.
We tried to convince Rashawn that she deserved better and that she needed to dump him.
They started to tell her, like, hey, maybe he's not this great guy that you think he is, and you should probably separate from him.
Eventually, she started to listen to us.
After time, Rashawn began to understand that the abuse was occurring, and she decided that she would not continue it.
Finally, in May 2014, after almost 6 years of dating, Rashawn worked up the courage to break up with Maurice.
She told Maurice that she was tired of being used and abused by him.
But she was still afraid of him. That's why she moved in with me.
To escape his reach and access, she moved back in with her mother.
He was still trying to harass her on the phone.
She didn't have no contact at all, but it was ways Maurice found her. That was what she would say, he would find me.
They had been apart for probably about 2 weeks, 3 weeks, when, you know, he didn't stop calling, didn't stop trying to text her, but she was separating herself from him, just going to work and just trying to get things back to normal.
I think that's why he came to the house last night, to confront her in person.
Based on what they're hearing, detectives agree that Maurice is a probable suspect. They just have one more question for Rashawn's loved ones.
Do you know what kind of car Maurice drives?
Yes, a white sedan.
The suspect from their surveillance footage was also driving a white sedan.
That's him. That's definitely him.
Armed with the family statement, detectives begin their work to bring Maurice to justice.
They have information that Maurice Nesbitt drives this white car, but that isn't sufficient, you know, for them to get an arrest warrant because nobody saw him shoot her. They needed more evidence, so they started doing a background search of Maurice Nesbitt.
When they run the background check, investigators discover that Maurice has a long criminal history.
They discovered that Maurice Nesbitt was a convicted felon. He did have a prior history for drugs, for guns, and also for domestic violence.
Some of the police reports were filed by Rashawn herself.
In one incident report from 2009, Rashawn reports that Maurice punched her in the face and kicked her in the mouth.
Maurice threatened to kill not only her, but her whole family if she didn't do what he wanted her to do.
Rashawn told police that Maurice was terrorizing her. It's clear to the detectives that this was an abusive relationship that was spiraling out of control.
And when investigators pull Maurice's DMV records, they confirm what Rashawn's loved ones told them. Maurice owns a white sedan, like the one seen in the surveillance video.
The car description from the DMV records matched the car that was on the crime scene the night of Rashawn's murder.
But the DMV records aren't the only proof the car belongs to Maurice.
They ended up finding one of his rap videos on YouTube. In the video, while he's rapping and stuff, he has this white car in the background.
For the police, this is a clear sign that they're on to the right track.
Detectives needed to speak with Maurice Nesbitt immediately.
Atlanta homicide investigators believe Maurice Nesbitt is responsible for the shooting death of his ex-girlfriend, 34-year-old Rashawn Jackson.
His car was spotted on surveillance at the apartment complex when Rashawn was killed, and he had been abusive to her in the past.
The detective's next move is try to have a sit-down interview and question Maurice, but when they reach out to him, he does not answer the phone.
So at this point, they issue a bolo for Maurice and a warrant for his arrest.
While patrol officers are on the hunt, investigators continue to build their case.
The DA's office gets involved at that point, and we start issuing subpoenas for phone records to see if, in addition to the car being in a surveillance video, we could link him there with his cell phone.
As they look through the log of calls and texts, what they see lines up with what they heard from Rashawn's family. Maurice refused to accept her rejection.
In the couple's messages, Rashawn is clearly pushing Maurice away, but he refuses to take no as an answer.
Whenever she tries to turn him away, he resorts to threats and insults.
There were several text messages where he would text her back to back to back. Why aren't you answering your phone? Why don't you answer your phone? Where are you?
Less than 2 weeks before the murder, Maurice even sent an overt threat.
Maurice sends a message that every dog has its day, and yours is coming up.
To investigators, this was a clear indication that he was plotting some type of revenge for Rashawn cutting him out of her life.
With every piece of evidence they came across, the police were convinced more and more that Maurice was responsible for this crime.
Their suspicions were heightened when they realized that Maurice was clearly laying low to avoid law enforcement.
Weeks go by without any sign of the wanted man.
There was no doubt in my mind. I knew it was Maurice. At that time, we was wondering, where is Maurice? How did he just do this and leave?
He was doing everything in his power to avoid coming in contact with law enforcement.
Then on July 23rd, 2014, investigators finally receive a solid lead on their fugitive.
Homicide.
Nearly 2 months after Rashawn was killed, police received a tip that Maurice was seen in Jonesboro, Georgia. Jonesboro is a very small community just south of Atlanta.
Police swiftly respond to the address provided by the tipster and take Maurice into custody. In an interrogation room, they hope he'll come clean, but those hopes are instantly dashed.
When the interrogation starts, Maurice immediately asks for a lawyer.
Give me my lawyer, man.
He declines to answer any questions.
But despite Maurice's unwillingness to give a statement, he has no choice but to give police a sample of his DNA.
They already had a warrant for the DNA, so he couldn't get out of that one. If his DNA is found on the items collected from Rayshawn's bedroom, they can place him at the scene of the crime.
Even without a confession, the investigators feel confident in the evidence they've gathered. They charge Maurice with felony murder and book him in the Fulton County Jail.
When Rashawn's family gets the information that Maurice had been arrested, they're relieved that he is finally behind bars.
Knowing that Maurice was finally arrested and actually facing a jury, that brought a big relief.
But that relief is short-lived.
Prosecutors really wanted to have those DNA results before the trial, but it was taking a while.
In Georgia, you have 90 days to indict someone after they've been in custody, or either they're entitled to bond at that point. So once the 90 days came, I believe his attorney filed a motion for a bond reduction hearing, and they presented some information that his health may be at risk, that he had cancer.
I've never heard of Rayshawn saying that he had cancer or being sick at all.
The judge, I'm not sure if they actually verified it or not, but he was granted a bond to deal with the issues surrounding his cancer.
His bond is set at $150,000, and he's actually able to make the bond. He was allowed to be released on an ankle monitor.
For Rashawn's family, this was infuriating and insulting, that the potential killer could just walk out of the courtroom, a free man, essentially.
When I first learned Maurice was out on bond, I felt like there was almost no justice there.
But when the DNA results from the crime scene come back, prosecutors finally feel ready to try the case.
When the test results come back, they are a positive match for the saliva found on the cigarette butts and the beer cans.
It places him in the room, which is really, really strong evidence.
Maurice Nesbitt's murder trial begins on September 25, 2017. In their opening statement, prosecutors argue that the couple's relationship reached a tipping point when Rashawn finally decided to leave.
She was getting fed up with it, and she had made up her mind and she wasn't gonna go back. And I guess that's when he decided that if he couldn't have her, then no one else could have her.
Once he felt that his control was being lost and she was finally breaking free, he couldn't handle that.
In the early morning hours of May 27th, Maurice was begging Rashawn to let him see her.
Around 3 o'clock in the morning, Maurice shows up to the apartment.
Records show Maurice had been spamming Rashawn's phone with calls.
So Rayshawn was probably expecting him.
Yeah, look, can I talk to you in person? I just need 5 minutes of your time, and that's it.
He asked to just talk and hang out for a few minutes. Rashawn lets him in.
Victims let their abusers back into their lives for numerous reasons: emotional attachment, hoping for change, or fear of retaliation. The cycle of abuse can make leaving these type of relationships permanently a difficult challenge.
Prosecutors argue Maurice convinced Rashawn to let him come up to her room.
And this feel like old times. I really been missing you.
I know. Maurice knows. I told you it's not like that between me and you anymore.
Instead of parting amicably, Maurice decided that he was going to put his plan in action and end her life.
Okay, if that's what you want.
Because there was no struggle at the scene of the crime, prosecutors believe that Rashawn never saw what was coming. She was totally taken by surprise.
While the woman he claimed to love for 6 years lay on the floor bleeding out, Maurice flees the scene and goes into hiding.
The prosecutors laid an insurmountable amount of evidence.
Maurice could tell things were not going in his favor.
By the 5th day of trial, prosecutors are feeling confident they'll have a win.
I was pleased with the evidence that I had put up, and we were about to do closings and get that conviction for her.
But Maurice has other plans.
What do you mean he's gone?
And on this morning, Maurice was not there.
Maurice had gone on the run.
Atlanta prosecutors are 5 days into the trial of aspiring rapper Maurice Nesbitt for the murder of his girlfriend of 6 years, Rashawn Jackson.
But now on the last day of the trial, Maurice has failed to show up to court. And by all indications, he's gone on the run.
It's getting closer and closer to time when court is supposed to start, and there's still no Maurice Nesbitt.
What do you mean he's gone?
They quickly tracked down Maurice's ankle monitor, and they were able to determine it was cut off 6 hours earlier.
Based on the information from his ankle monitor, Maurice was last seen heading south from Atlanta on Interstate 75.
By now, investigators know he could be hundreds of miles away.
Atlanta police now issue a BOLO, and surrounding agencies are notified.
He's considered armed and dangerous.
Back at the courthouse, prosecutors present a plan to proceed with the trial in Maurice's absence.
The state argued that it would be unfair to Rashawn and her family to have to do this again.
The judge agrees, and Maurice's trial continues without him.
The judge decided that we would do the closing arguments with him not being present and let the jury deliberate without him being present, which was great for the state. We can argue now, he did it, that's why he's gone, that's why he ran.
The jury agrees.
They find Maurice guilty of felony murder, aggravated assault, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony.
He is sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 5 years for the weapons charges.
But investigators still have to find him.
Maurice not being there for his sentencing was kind of crazy. It was very sad knowing that he wasn't there for his sentencing.
He moved underground, he was just moving around so that he couldn't be seen.
Weeks go by with no sign of the wanted fugitive and no leads on his whereabouts.
Since his mother's from Mexico, they think he could have fled the country.
The Mexican authorities got involved, and they did everything in their power to track him down. Unfortunately, there were never any solid leads.
Weeks turn into months, and months turn into years with no sign of Maurice.
3.5 long years go by without any new developments. But that changes on April 12, 2021, when the case receives renewed national attention.
The story is featured on In Pursuit with John Walsh and America's Most Wanted.
The tactic pays off.
Someone watching the show recognized him as their roommate and called the police to have him arrested.
The anonymous tipster says that Maurice is living under an assumed identity in Birmingham, Alabama.
They actually give the police the exact address where Maurice is hiding out.
On April 19th, police finally arrest Maurice Nesbitt again. And this time, they aren't letting him go.
Maurice is extradited back to Georgia, where he finally begins to serve the prison sentence the jury handed to him.
The same judge that tried to...
On the evening of June 12, 1977, Camp Scott looked exactly the way a summer camp was supposed to look. The Oklahoma air was still warm from the fading sun, the forest stretched endlessly beyond the rows of canvas tents, and hundreds of Girl Scouts had just begun what many of them believed would become one of the happiest weeks of their childhood. Parents had driven for hours to bring their daughters here. Cars disappeared down dusty roads while children waved goodbye with the kind of excitement that only comes from believing adventure is waiting just around the corner. For most families, that goodbye was routine. A week later, they expected to return to collect children carrying handmade crafts, muddy shoes, and stories that would be told for decades. 3 families would never experience that reunion. Before sunrise, something had happened inside the darkness surrounding Camp Scott. 3 young girls who had spent only a few hours inside their shared tent vanished into the night. When daylight finally reached the woods, camp staff discovered a scene so horrifying that it permanently altered the history of American summer camps. What should have been remembered as the beginning of an ordinary camping trip instead became the beginning of one of the most haunting unsolved murder cases in the United States. The victims were only 8, 9, and 10 years old. Their names were Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner. 4 decades, investigators, journalists, criminologists, and ordinary citizens have returned to this case again and again, searching for answers hidden somewhere inside thousands of pages of reports, photographs, witness statements, forensic examinations, courtroom testimony, and unanswered questions. A suspect was arrested. A trial was held. A jury reached its verdict. Modern DNA testing revisited the evidence years later. Yet despite everything, one devastating truth remains unchanged. No court has ever established who murdered those 3 children. That uncertainty is what continues to haunt this story. It is not simply a murder investigation. It is a story about trust, about innocence, about how one terrifying night shattered the belief that children could disappear into the woods of a summer camp and always come back safely the next morning. It is also a story about an investigation that inspired endless debate, divided opinions, and left behind questions that still refuse to disappear nearly half a century later. Every true crime case begins with a single moment when ordinary life quietly slips into tragedy. Sometimes that moment is obvious. Sometimes nobody realizes it until much later. In the case of the Girl Scout murders, the transition was almost invisible. There was no warning siren echoing through the camp. There was no dramatic confrontation witnessed by dozens of people. Hundreds of children slept peacefully that night, completely unaware that somewhere beyond the thin walls of canvas tents, something unimaginably terrible was unfolding. The forest surrounding Camp Scott had always represented freedom. It was a place where children learned independence, built friendships, explored nature, and discovered confidence far away from television screens and city streets. The woods were meant to inspire curiosity, not fear. Yet after June 1977, those same trees came to symbolize something entirely different. Their silence became unsettling. Their darkness became suspicious. Their beauty became inseparable from a crime that has never truly been explained. This story is often remembered because of its mystery, but mystery should never overshadow the people at its center. Before investigators collected evidence, before reporters filled newspaper headlines, before courtrooms debated guilt and innocence, there were simply 3 little girls excited about spending a week at camp. They packed clothes chosen by their parents. They said goodbye at home. They climbed into cars carrying sleeping bags and suitcases. Like every other child arriving that summer, they believed they were beginning an adventure. None of them knew they were walking into history. The events that followed have been examined from almost every possible angle. Investigators reconstructed movements, measured footprints, compared forensic samples, questioned witnesses, and pursued leads that stretched across Oklahoma. Public attention quickly focused on a man named Gene Leroy Hart, an escaped convict with a violent criminal history who had been hiding in the forests near Camp Scott. To many people, the circumstances seemed impossible to ignore. Yet criminal investigations are not solved through suspicion alone. Evidence must withstand scrutiny, and in this case, the evidence became the subject of intense legal and public debate. Years later, advances in forensic science would provide new opportunities to examine physical evidence collected from the scene, but even those developments stopped short of delivering the certainty that investigators and the victims' families had hoped for. That unresolved ending is part of what has kept this case alive for generations. It continues to be studied not only because of the violence of the crime, but because it illustrates how difficult it can be to distinguish suspicion from proof. It also demonstrates how limitations in forensic science during the 1970s affected investigations whose consequences would last for decades. But before detectives arrived, before evidence markers covered the ground, before helicopters, newspaper cameras, and courtroom testimony transformed Camp Scott into a place known across America, there was only a quiet summer evening. Children laughed. Counselors organized activities. Parents drove home believing their daughters were safe. The camp settled into darkness just as it had on countless nights before. Somewhere beyond the tents, however, the ordinary rhythm of that evening was about to end forever. As the first light of morning slowly reached Camp Scott on June 13, 1977, nothing about the sunrise suggested that history was about to change. Dawn arrived the same way it always had over the rolling hills of northeastern Oklahoma. The forest awakened gradually, and another day at summer camp should have been beginning. Counselors prepared for morning routines. Children who had fallen asleep only hours earlier were expected to wake, dress, and gather for breakfast before beginning a full schedule of outdoor activities. Instead, the camp found itself at the center of a tragedy that would reverberate far beyond Oklahoma. The discovery of the three girls transformed Camp Scott from a place associated with childhood adventure into the focus of one of the largest homicide investigations in the state's history. News spread rapidly across local communities before reaching national audiences. Newspapers, television stations, and law enforcement agencies converged on a case that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The questions began immediately. How could something like this happen inside a summer camp? How could 3 children disappear during the night without alerting the hundreds of people sleeping nearby? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, who was responsible? Those questions have endured for decades because the investigation never produced the certainty that people expected. A suspect was identified, arrested, and brought to trial, but the legal process ended without a murder conviction. Later advances in forensic science prompted investigators to re-examine evidence collected in 1977, yet even modern DNA testing did not conclusively identify the killer. As a result, the case remains one of the most discussed unresolved homicide investigations in American criminal history. Over the years, countless books, documentaries, podcasts, and investigative reports have revisited the events at Camp Scott. Some have focused on the criminal investigation. Others have examined the courtroom proceedings, the forensic evidence, or the broader impact the case had on camping safety across the United States. The passage of time has not diminished public interest. If anything, it has reinforced a painful reality. Despite decades of analysis, some questions remain unanswered. When discussing cases like this, it is easy to become absorbed by the mystery itself. The search for suspects, forensic evidence, and investigative breakthroughs naturally captures attention. Yet those elements should never overshadow the lives that were lost. Before this became an infamous criminal investigation, it was a devastating loss for 3 families whose daughters never returned home from what was meant to be an ordinary summer camp. This account is not intended to sensationalize violence or speculate beyond the evidence. Where the historical record provides clear facts, those facts will guide the story. Where uncertainty remains, that uncertainty will be acknowledged rather than filled with invention. The distinction matters because unresolved cases often attract myths, rumors, and unsupported theories that can obscure the documented record. Respecting the available evidence is also a way of respecting the victims and the people whose lives were permanently changed by the events of June 1977. As this story unfolds, it will follow the chronology of the case from the setting of Camp Scott and the lives of the 3 girls, through the crime, the investigation, the trial, and the later forensic reviews that revisited the evidence. Along the way, it will examine why investigators considered Jean Leroy Hart the principal suspect, why the prosecution believed the available evidence pointed toward him, why the defense challenged those conclusions, and why the jury ultimately acquitted him of the murders. It will also explore how later scientific testing both clarified and complicated aspects of the investigation without resolving the central question of responsibility. Nearly half a century has passed since that June morning, Yet the Girl Scout murders continue to occupy a unique place in American criminal history. The case altered public perceptions of safety at children's camps, prompted changes in security practices, and became a reminder that even the most carefully planned environments can be vulnerable to acts of violence. It also stands as an example of the challenges investigators face when critical evidence cannot establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Some stories conclude with certainty. This is not one of them. What happened at Camp Scott is documented in police reports, court records, forensic examinations, and the memories of those who lived through the investigation. But the identity of the person or persons responsible has never been established in a court of law. That unresolved truth continues to define the case, making it both a historical tragedy and an enduring investigation whose central question remains unanswered. Before examining the evidence, the suspects, and the legal proceedings, it is important to return to where the story truly began, not with a crime scene, but with a summer camp preparing to welcome children who arrived expecting friendship, adventure, and a week they would never have the chance to finish. There are cases that are remembered because investigators solved them against impossible odds. There are others that become infamous because the evidence ultimately revealed a truth no one expected. And then there are the rare cases that seem to exist in a permanent state of uncertainty, where every answer uncovers another question and every conclusion is challenged by what cannot be proven. The Girl Scout murders belong to that final category. Even today, nearly 50 years later, discussions surrounding the case remain deeply divided. Some believe investigators identified the correct suspect but could never assemble evidence strong enough to secure a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. Others argue that unanswered forensic questions leave open the possibility that the investigation never reached the full truth. The historical record reflects these differing interpretations, and they remain part of why the case continues to be studied. What does not change, regardless of perspective, is the irreversible loss suffered by three families whose lives were forever divided into two chapters, before June 1977, and everything that followed. The passage of time has changed almost everything else. Camp Scott is no longer remembered primarily as a place where children learned outdoor skills and formed lifelong friendships. Instead, its name is inseparable from one of the darkest chapters in the history of youth camping in the United States. Advances in forensic science have transformed homicide investigations since the 1970s, allowing modern detectives to solve cases once thought impossible. Yet this investigation demonstrates that scientific progress cannot always compensate for the limitations of evidence collected decades earlier. Some questions simply become harder to answer as witnesses grow older, memories fade, and physical evidence deteriorates despite careful preservation. For investigators, the case became an enduring lesson in the importance of every decision made during the earliest stages of a homicide inquiry. For prosecutors, it illustrated the difference between suspicion and proof. For defense attorneys, it underscored the principle that criminal convictions require evidence capable of overcoming reasonable doubt. And for parents across America, it shattered a sense of security that many had taken for granted. Summer camps did not disappear after 1977, but expectations surrounding their safety changed. Organizations responsible for children's programs introduced stronger security measures, reviewed emergency procedures, and placed greater emphasis on protecting campers throughout the night. Those changes formed part of the lasting legacy of the tragedy, even though they could never undo what had already happened. As we move through this story, it is important to separate documented fact from later speculation. Over the decades, numerous theories have circulated in books, television programs, online discussions, and informal conversations. Some raise questions about the interpretation of forensic evidence. Others speculate about alternative suspects or additional participants. Unless supported by verifiable evidence contained within the investigative record or subsequent documented reviews, those theories remain speculation rather than established fact. In unresolved cases, distinguishing between evidence and conjecture is essential, particularly when real people and real families continue to live with the consequences. The story you are about to hear is built upon the documented chronology of events, the arrival of the campers, the tragedy that unfolded during the night, the extensive investigation conducted by law enforcement, the prosecution of Jean Leroy Hart, his acquittal by a jury, and the later forensic examinations that revisited evidence with technologies unavailable in 1977. Where uncertainty exists, it will remain acknowledged as uncertainty rather than being replaced with imagined certainty. Because sometimes the most unsettling part of a true crime story is not what investigators know. It is what they never managed to prove. And sometimes, after decades of searching, the silence left behind by unanswered questions becomes almost as significant as the evidence itself. This is the story of Camp Scott. This is the story of Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner. And this is the story of a case that continues to challenge investigators, historians, legal scholars, and the public nearly half a century after one summer night changed countless lives forever. In the next chapter, we begin not with the investigation, but with the world that existed before tragedy struck, a quiet summer camp in northeastern Oklahoma, where hundreds of children arrived expecting adventure, friendship, and memories that would last a lifetime, unaware that history was already moving silently toward them. Before Camp Scott became a name associated with tragedy, it was simply a summer camp hidden among the wooded hills of northeastern Oklahoma. It was a place designed for children to step away from the routines of everyday life and experience something different. Away from the noise of cities, away from television screens, away from the constant presence of parents and familiar surroundings, the camp offered something many children treasured: a small taste of independence. For the girls who arrived there in June of 1977, Camp Scott represented adventure. It represented new friendships waiting to be made, campfire stories waiting to be told, outdoor activities waiting to be explored. It was the kind of place where children carried sleeping bags instead of schoolbooks, where mornings began with group activities instead of alarm clocks, and where evenings ended beneath a sky filled with stars rather than the familiar walls of home. The camp was located in Mayes County, Oklahoma, surrounded by the natural landscape of the region. The area was characterized by forests, hills, and rural roads that created a feeling of isolation from the outside world. For many visitors, that isolation was part of the appeal. A summer camp was supposed to feel like an escape. The distance from crowded neighborhoods and busy streets was exactly what made the experience memorable. But that same isolation would later become one of the most important elements in understanding the tragedy. The environment that made Camp Scott attractive also created challenges. The wooded terrain provided countless hiding places. The surrounding roads were quiet and unfamiliar to outsiders. At night, once the sun disappeared beyond the trees, the camp became a world of shadows and limited visibility. The sounds of nature filled the darkness, the movement of animals, the rustling of leaves, the changing sounds of the forest. In a place like this, where darkness arrived quickly and distances could be deceptive, a person could move through the area without being easily noticed. Yet on that summer evening, none of those possibilities were at the forefront of anyone's mind. The adults responsible for the camp believed they were creating a safe environment for children. The Girl Scout organization had long been associated with teaching confidence, responsibility, teamwork, and personal growth. Summer camping was an important part of that tradition. It allowed young girls to practice skills they might not experience at home, preparing meals outdoors, navigating trails, working together, and developing independence. For parents, sending a child to camp was often a significant moment. It required trust. Trust in the counselors. Trust in the organization. Trust that the environment had been prepared carefully and that their children would return home with stories of fun and accomplishment. The families of Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner shared that same expectation. Their daughters were not arriving at Camp Scott as names that would later appear in newspapers or investigative reports. They were children beginning a summer experience. They were individuals with personalities, interests, friendships, and families who loved them. Laurie Lee Farmer was 8 years old. Like many children her age, she was still in a stage of discovering the world around her. 8 years old is an age filled with curiosity, imagination, and a growing desire to try new things. A summer camp offered the perfect environment for that sense of exploration. Michelle Gouza was 9 years old. She was entering an age where friendships and shared experiences became increasingly important. Camp was a chance to meet other children, participate in activities, and create memories separate from school and home. Doris Denise Milner was 10 years old, the oldest of the 3 girls. At 10, many children begin taking on greater responsibility and developing a stronger sense of independence. A camping trip could feel like an important step toward growing up. Although their ages were close, each girl had her own identity. Each had a family waiting for her return. Each had a future that was supposed to continue far beyond that summer. The tragedy that occurred at Camp Scott would later cause many people to look back at the location differently. Investigators would examine the layout of the camp, the placement of tents, the surrounding woods, and the paths that connected different areas. Every physical detail became significant. A location that had once been designed for recreation became a landscape of evidence. But on the first day of the campers' arrival, none of that existed yet. There was no crime scene. There were no investigators walking through the trees. There were no evidence markers placed on the ground. There were only children arriving with excitement. The summer camp atmosphere was familiar across America during that era. Many children spent their summers participating in organized activities, learning outdoor skills, and spending time away from home. Safety procedures existed, but expectations were different from those of later decades. The widespread awareness of certain dangers involving children's programs had not yet developed to the level seen today. The events at Camp Scott would become one of the cases that changed that perception. The tragedy forced organizations and communities to reconsider assumptions that had previously seemed obvious. A location created for children could not rely only on good intentions. Safety required planning, preparation, monitoring, and constant attention. The innocence associated with childhood activities needed to be protected through deliberate systems rather than simple trust. But before those lessons were learned, before security practices changed, before Camp Scott became a symbol of caution, it was simply a summer camp preparing for another season. The staff members working there likely expected the weeks ahead to follow a familiar pattern. Children would arrive. Activities would take place. Friendships would form. Parents would return at the end of the session to collect their daughters and hear stories about everything that had happened. That was the promise of summer camp. A temporary world where children could experience something new while their families waited safely at home. For 3 families, that promise would be broken in a single night. And to understand the impact of what happened, it is necessary to understand the place where it happened not only as a crime scene, but as it existed before tragedy changed its meaning forever. Because every location has a history before it becomes part of a tragedy. Camp Scott had a history before June 1977. It was a place of laughter before it became a place of questions. A place of childhood memories before it became a place of unanswered grief. In the summer of 1977, America was a country experiencing change. It was a period when many families still held onto traditions that had existed for generations. Children spent long afternoons outside, neighborhoods often knew one another closely, and summer activities frequently meant leaving the familiar environment of home for experiences built around community and trust. For many parents, sending a child to a Girl Scout camp was not seen as a risky decision. It was considered an opportunity. The Girl Scout movement had spent decades building a reputation around confidence, leadership, and personal development. Camping was not simply about sleeping outdoors. It was about teaching young girls practical skills and encouraging them to become more independent. A child who arrived at camp might learn how to navigate trails, prepare food, cooperate with others, and overcome small challenges without the immediate assistance of family. For children, those lessons often felt like adventure. For parents, they represented growth. Camp Scott existed within that tradition. It was a place where adults believed they were giving children a safe opportunity to explore the world beyond their homes. The camp's location contributed heavily to its character. Unlike urban summer programs surrounded by buildings, streets, and constant activity, Camp Scott was immersed in nature. The surrounding forest created distance from everyday life. Trees surrounded the area, separating the camp from the outside world. The landscape gave campers the feeling that they were somewhere completely different, somewhere removed from ordinary responsibilities. During daylight hours, that isolation could feel peaceful. The forest offered shade from the summer heat. The open spaces allowed children to run, play, and participate in outdoor activities. The natural surroundings created the atmosphere that many people imagined when they thought of childhood camping. But after sunset, the same environment changed. The woods became quieter. Visibility disappeared. Familiar paths became difficult to recognize. The distance between one part of the camp and another became more significant. Sounds carried differently at night, sometimes becoming difficult to identify. A movement among trees could belong to an animal, the wind, or something else entirely. In places surrounded by wilderness, darkness has a way of changing perception. During the day, a forest invites exploration. At night, it can create uncertainty. That contrast would later become one of the defining characteristics of the Camp Scott investigation. When detectives arrived after the tragedy, they were not examining a simple indoor location with controlled conditions. They were dealing with an outdoor environment where evidence could be affected by weather, movement, and time. The very features that made the camp attractive to children also complicated the search for answers. The investigation would eventually focus on questions about movement through the camp, how someone could approach the area, how they could leave, and whether anyone could have witnessed or heard what happened. Every path, every section of woodland, and every distance between locations became important. But before those questions existed, Camp Scott functioned as it was intended. It was a place where children gathered. A place where counselors guided activities. A place where parents believed their daughters were protected. The trust placed in the camp was not unusual. Across the country, thousands of families made similar decisions every summer. They entrusted organizations with their children because they believed those organizations understood the responsibility they carried. That trust is one of the most important themes in the story of the Girl Scout murders. The tragedy did not only affect 3 families. It affected the broader idea of childhood safety. It challenged assumptions that certain places were naturally protected simply because they were designed for children. A summer camp could have caring staff members. It could have established routines. It could have a respected organization behind it. Yet the events at Camp Scott demonstrated that safety depended on more than intentions. It depended on preparation. It depended on awareness. It depended on recognizing dangers before they became realities. In the weeks and months after the murders, camps and youth organizations across America examined their own procedures. Questions that had previously received less attention became urgent. How were camps monitored overnight? Who had access to the grounds? How were unfamiliar people identified? What steps were taken when something unusual was discovered? These questions became part of a national conversation about protecting children. But on June 12, 1977, those questions had not yet been asked. That evening, Camp Scott was filled with the ordinary details of summer. Children settling into their sleeping areas. Campers preparing for the days ahead. Adults organizing responsibilities. The excitement of a new experience still fresh. The 3 girls at the center of this tragedy were among many children who arrived with expectations of friendship and fun. They were not aware that their names would one day be connected to a major criminal investigation. They were not aware that the place where they were supposed to create happy memories would become the focus of national attention. They were simply children at camp. And that detail matters. Because when a crime becomes famous, there is a danger that the victims become reduced to a case title, a newspaper headline, or a chapter in a documentary. The phrase Girl Scout murders carries the weight of the investigation, the suspect, the trial, and the unanswered questions. But before there was a case, there were 3 individual lives. There were families. There were homes waiting for their return. There were ordinary moments that would later become precious memories. The true beginning of this story is not the crime itself. It is the world that existed before it. A world where 3 young girls packed their belongings, said goodbye to their families, and traveled to a place that promised adventure. A world where Camp Scott was not yet associated with fear. A world where the idea that something terrible could happen there seemed impossible. And that is what makes the events that followed so difficult to understand. Because tragedy rarely announces itself. It arrives in places where people feel safe. It enters moments that are supposed to be ordinary. And on one summer night in Oklahoma, the quiet world of Camp Scott was changed forever. The evening of June 12, 1977, began like many other evenings at summer camps across America. There was nothing about the setting that suggested danger. Nothing that warned the campers, counselors, or families waiting at home that the hours ahead would become part of a case remembered for generations. Camp Scott followed the familiar rhythm of a summer program. After a full day of activities, children gradually settled into the slower pace of evening. The excitement of arrival began to fade as the first night at camp came to an end. For many campers, the unfamiliar surroundings would soon become comfortable. The sounds of the forest, the shared conversations inside tents, and the experience of sleeping away from home would become part of the adventure they had imagined before arriving. The first night at camp often carries a unique feeling for children. It is a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. Some campers are eager to experience independence for the first time. Others miss the familiar comfort of home. Some stay awake longer than expected, talking quietly with new friends, sharing stories, and imagining what the following days will bring. For Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Guza, and Doris Denise Milner, that night was supposed to be the beginning of a summer memory. Instead, it became the final night of their lives. The girls were staying in a tent area known as the Kiowa Unit, where they were among other campers participating in the program. Their tent was not an isolated structure hidden miles away from the rest of the camp. Other people were nearby. Other children were sleeping. Counselors were present. Yet the events that occurred during the night happened without immediate detection. That detail became one of the most troubling aspects of the case. How could something happen inside a populated summer camp without anyone realizing? That question would follow investigators throughout the entire investigation. In any criminal case, the environment matters. The location can reveal opportunities, limitations, and possibilities. At Camp Scott, investigators had to consider not only what evidence was left behind, but also the physical reality of the area. The camp covered a large wooded space. Visibility was limited, especially at night. Movement between locations could occur without being easily observed. The forest surrounding the camp created both beauty and vulnerability. During the day, the trees provided a natural backdrop for outdoor activities. They represented exploration and discovery. At night, they created shadows and uncertainty. The same landscape that encouraged children to connect with nature also made it more difficult to know what was happening beyond immediate surroundings. The darkness of the forest became part of the mystery. When morning arrived, the ordinary routine of the camp was interrupted by an unimaginable discovery. The expectation of another normal day disappeared. Instead of children preparing for breakfast and activities, adults were confronted with a scene that would forever change their lives. The transition from a peaceful summer camp to an active crime scene happened within hours. A place created for childhood experiences became the center of a homicide investigation. Law enforcement officers who arrived at Camp Scott faced an enormous challenge. They were not only investigating the deaths of 3 children, they were attempting to reconstruct events that had occurred in an outdoor environment where the passage of time could affect evidence. They had to determine what happened, when it happened, and who could have entered or left the area without being noticed. Every detail mattered. The location of the victims. The condition of the scene. The physical evidence recovered. The statements of those who had been present. The smallest pieces of information could potentially answer the biggest questions. But before the investigation began, before the first police reports were written, before the suspect theories emerged, there were families waking up on the morning of June 13 unaware that their lives were about to change forever. Some parents expected to hear stories about camp activities. They expected their daughters to return with memories of friendships and experiences. They expected a normal reunion. Instead, they would receive news no parent should ever have to hear. The emotional impact of the case extended far beyond the boundaries of Camp Scott. The victims' families faced a loss that could never be repaired. The community faced fear and disbelief. Parents across the country questioned whether places they trusted to care for their children were truly as safe as they believed. The tragedy created a lasting divide in the history of the camp itself. There was the Camp Scott that existed before June 13, 1977, a place of childhood activities and summer traditions. And there was the Camp Scott that existed afterward, a location permanently connected to questions, investigation, and grief. This transformation is common in cases that become historically significant. Locations become symbols of the events that occurred there. A street corner, a house, a building, or a piece of land can carry a memory that extends far beyond the physical location itself. Camp Scott became one of those places. But behind the name of the case, behind the headlines and legal arguments, the story remained about three children. Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, Doris Denise Milner. Their lives were much larger than the tragedy that took them. They had families who knew them, people who loved them, and futures that ended far too soon. The investigation would focus on finding answers, but the reason those answers mattered was because 3 young lives had been taken. The search for justice began because of them. As investigators entered the woods around Camp Scott and began piecing together what happened during those dark hours, they were not simply examining evidence from a crime scene. They were trying to understand how a place built around childhood innocence became the setting for an unimaginable crime. And that search would lead to one of the most controversial investigations in American criminal history. Before their names became associated with one of the most infamous unsolved murder cases in American history, Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner were simply 3 young girls preparing for a summer adventure. They were not symbols. They were not case files. They were not names written in police reports or repeated in courtrooms. They were children. They had families who knew their voices, their habits, their personalities, and the small details that made them unique. They had ordinary days filled with school, friendships, family conversations, and childhood dreams. They had futures that were supposed to unfold slowly, 1 year at a time. The tragedy at Camp Scott would eventually become the focus of investigators, journalists, and legal professionals. But before examining evidence, suspects, and unanswered questions, it is essential to remember the lives that existed before the crime. Because every victim in a true crime story was once a person with a world of their own. And Lori, Michelle, and Doris each had a story. Lori Lee Farmer was the youngest of the 3 girls. She was 8 years old. At that age, childhood still exists in a unique space between complete dependence and growing independence. An 8-year-old is old enough to begin discovering the world beyond the family home, but still young enough to find comfort in familiar faces and routines. It is an age filled with curiosity, imagination, and the belief that new experiences are invitations to explore. For Lori, attending Girl Scout camp represented exactly that kind of experience. A summer camp was a place where a child could step into a new environment and feel a sense of adventure. It offered opportunities to learn, participate, and become part of a group. For a young girl, spending time away from home could feel like a major milestone. The journey to Camp Scott was supposed to be a happy one. Like countless children before her, Lori arrived carrying the excitement of something new. She entered a world of tents, outdoor activities, and unfamiliar surroundings that would soon become more familiar. She was surrounded by other children experiencing the same mixture of anticipation and nervousness. The camp was meant to be a place where she could create memories. No one knew those memories would be replaced by tragedy. Michelle Gouza was 9 years old. At 9, a child begins to develop a stronger sense of identity. Friendships become increasingly meaningful. Experiences outside the home begin shaping how children see themselves and the world around them. For many children, summer camp is remembered as a special moment because it allows them to experience something different from their everyday routine. There are new people to meet, new activities to try, new challenges to overcome. Michelle, like the other campers, arrived at Camp Scott expecting those simple childhood experiences. She was there to participate. She was there to make memories. She was there because the adults around her believed the environment was safe. That belief is one of the most painful parts of the story. The tragedy did not happen in a place known for danger. It happened in a place specifically created for children. It happened in an environment built around trust. For Michelle's family, the loss was not only the loss of a daughter. It was the loss of every future moment they expected to share with her. The birthdays that would never come. The conversations they would never have. The milestones they would never witness. A child's future is measured not only in years but in possibilities. Every year represents new experiences waiting to happen. When a child's life ends, those possibilities disappear with them. Doris Denise Milner was 10 years old. As the oldest of the three girls, she was at an age where many children begin to experience a greater sense of responsibility. 10 years old often represents a transition period, still very much childhood, but with the beginnings of independence becoming more visible. For Doris, camp was an opportunity to grow. It was an opportunity to spend time with others, learn new skills, and experience something outside her normal surroundings. Like Laurie and Michelle, she arrived at Camp Scott believing she was entering a safe environment. She had no reason to believe otherwise. The adults responsible for the camp believed otherwise. Her family believed otherwise. The other campers believed otherwise. That shared belief that children could be placed in a caring environment and return home safely is what made the crime so devastating. When cases become famous, there is often a tendency to focus on the unknown. Who did it? Why did it happen? What evidence was missed? What could have been done differently? Those questions are important. They are part of understanding a criminal investigation and learning from the failures that may have occurred. But sometimes, the victims can become lost behind the mystery. The phrase Girl Scout murders carries the weight of the crime, but Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner were more than victims of a case. They were daughters, friends, and children whose lives mattered before tragedy gave them a place in history. Their families did not know them as part of a mystery. They knew them through everyday moments. Through conversations. Through laughter. Through memories that existed long before investigators arrived at Camp Scott. That is the reality behind every victim-centered story. The person existed before the crime. The crime was only the final chapter. It was never the whole story. The events of June 1977 created questions that investigators would spend years trying to answer. But the reason those questions mattered was because three young girls were no longer able to continue writing their own stories. Their families were left with grief that no verdict could fully resolve. Even if a person had been convicted, even if every question had been answered, justice could never restore the lives that were lost. The purpose of remembering Laurie, Michelle, and Doris is not only to understand what happened to them. It is to remember who they were before it happened. Three girls who went to summer camp. 3 children who should have returned home. 3 lives that ended far too soon. And as the investigation moved forward, authorities would begin the difficult task of reconstructing their final hours, searching through evidence and uncertainty in an effort to understand what happened inside the quiet woods of Camp Scott. The impact of a crime is often measured through investigations, court proceedings, and public attention. But for the families of Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner, the tragedy was not an investigation. It was a permanent change in the shape of their lives. For law enforcement, the case became a search for evidence. For prosecutors, it became a question of responsibility. For the public, it became a mystery. But for 3 families, it became grief. A child's death creates a silence that cannot be filled by explanations, theories, or years of searching. The loss is not only the moment when a life ends. It is the disappearance of every future moment that family members expected to experience. Parents imagine watching their children grow older. They imagine future birthdays, graduations, conversations, and ordinary days that seem insignificant until they are suddenly gone. A child's future is made of countless small moments that families rarely realize they are collecting until those moments can no longer happen. For the families of the three girls, the tragedy at Camp Scott meant losing all of those possibilities. When children leave home for a summer activity, parents often focus on the practical details. Did they pack enough clothes? Did they remember everything they needed? Will they enjoy themselves? Will they make friends? These are ordinary questions asked by parents everywhere. They are questions filled with expectation, not fear. The families of Laurie, Michelle, and Doris sent their daughters to Camp Scott believing they were giving them an experience that would help them grow. They believed their children would return with stories about camp activities, new friendships, and memories created under the Oklahoma summer sky. Instead, the families received news that no parent expects. The transition from anticipation to tragedy happened with devastating speed. One day, a child is preparing for an adventure. The next day, a family is forced to confront a reality that cannot be changed. The emotional distance between those two moments is impossible to measure. The investigation that followed would focus on identifying the person responsible. Detectives would examine physical evidence, question witnesses, and reconstruct the events of that night. But behind every investigative decision was the understanding that 3 children had been taken from their families. The search for answers was not only about solving a crime. It was about giving those families a sense of justice. For many victims' families, the uncertainty surrounding an unsolved or disputed case creates an additional burden. Grief is already overwhelming, but unanswered questions can make that grief more complicated. There is no single moment when the story feels complete. There is no final explanation that allows everyone to move forward. In the Camp Scott case, even after a suspect was identified and a trial was held, the legal outcome did not erase those questions. Jean Leroy Hart was acquitted of the murders in 1979. The verdict meant that, legally, he was not found responsible for the deaths of the 3 girls. But an acquittal does not bring back a child. It does not remove the pain of loss. It does not return the future that disappeared. The names Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Guza, and Doris Denise Milner became known across the country because of the circumstances surrounding their deaths. But their identities were never meant to be defined by tragedy. They were children living ordinary lives. They had families who loved them. They had personalities that existed beyond the brief descriptions found in newspapers. They had interests, friendships, and experiences that belonged only to them. Remembering victims in true crime requires acknowledging that their lives were larger than the crime committed against them. The details of an investigation may explain how authorities searched for answers, but they cannot fully describe who the victims were as people. A case file contains evidence. A family contains memories. Those memories are where victims truly continue to exist. The tragedy also affected the wider Girl Scout community. Across the country, parents who had trusted youth organizations began asking difficult questions. The case challenged assumptions about safety and forced many organizations to examine procedures that had previously been considered adequate. The changes that followed were significant. Overnight supervision, security practices, and emergency planning received increased attention. Camps and youth programs became more aware that protecting children required detailed preparation and constant evaluation. Those changes became part of the legacy of the case. But no safety improvement could change what happened to Laurie, Michelle, and Doris. No policy could restore the lives already lost. No investigation could undo the moment when 3 families received devastating news. One of the most difficult aspects of the Girl Scout murders is the contrast between the purpose of the place and the tragedy that occurred there. Camp Scott existed to create positive experiences. It was designed to help children develop confidence. It was supposed to be a place where memories were created. Instead, it became the setting for one of the most painful chapters in American true crime history. That contrast is what makes the case so deeply unsettling. The victims were not in a place associated with danger. They were not doing something unusual or reckless. They were participating in an activity that countless children had experienced before and after them. They were simply children at summer camp. And that ordinary truth is what makes their story so heartbreaking. Decades later, discussions about the case continue to focus on evidence, suspects, and unanswered questions. Those discussions are important for understanding the investigation. They help explain why the case remains unresolved and why opinions about it continue to differ. But at the center of everything are three names: Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, Doris Denise Milner. Their story began long before investigators arrived at Camp Scott. It began in homes, families, friendships, and everyday moments that had nothing to do with crime. The tragedy took away their futures, but it cannot erase the fact that those futures existed. They were daughters before they were victims. They were children before they became part of a case. And remembering that distinction is the most important part of telling their story. Summer is often remembered through small moments. The smell of grass after a warm afternoon. The excitement of leaving home for a new experience. The feeling of carrying a bag packed with everything needed for an adventure. The nervous anticipation of meeting new people. For many children, summer represents freedom. It is a break from classrooms, schedules, and familiar routines. It is a time when ordinary days can become unforgettable memories. For Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner, the summer of 1977 was supposed to be exactly that. A time of discovery. A time of friendship. A time they would remember for the rest of their lives. But history would remember it differently. Instead of becoming a collection of happy memories, their time at Camp Scott became frozen in a single tragic moment. Their names became connected to a crime that would dominate headlines, challenge investigators, and remain a subject of discussion decades later. Yet their lives were not defined by what happened at Camp Scott. Their lives existed before that night. And understanding that is essential. Children often approach new experiences with a kind of optimism adults sometimes lose over time. A child can look at an unfamiliar place and see possibility before danger. A forest is not immediately a place of uncertainty. It is a place to explore. A tent is not a vulnerable shelter. It is an exciting place to sleep. A new group of children are not strangers. They are potential friends. That perspective is part of childhood innocence. It is also what made the events at Camp Scott so difficult for people across the country to understand. The girls who arrived there were participating in something completely ordinary. They were part of a tradition shared by generations of children. They were learning, growing, and experiencing independence in a structured environment. Nothing about their arrival suggested that they were entering a moment that would become one of the most painful cases in American criminal history. For Lori Lee Farmer, at 8 years old, the world was still filled with discovery. At that age, children are constantly learning about themselves and the world around them. Every new experience has the possibility of becoming a story they will tell again and again. A camping trip is exactly the kind of experience many children remember. The unfamiliar sounds of nighttime. The excitement of sleeping somewhere different. The activities that feel special simply because they happen away from home. The friendships created in a short amount of time. Those are the memories that Camp Scott was meant to provide. For Lori, the opportunity to attend camp should have been another chapter in a childhood filled with ordinary moments. It should have been a story about growing confidence, learning new things, and returning home with experiences to share. Instead, her name became permanently connected to a tragedy she never should have experienced. Michelle Gouza was 9 years old, an age when many children begin developing stronger connections outside their immediate families. Friendships become increasingly important. Children begin discovering their own interests and personalities. They start understanding where they fit among their peers. A summer camp creates a unique environment for that growth. Away from the familiar structure of home and school, children are encouraged to participate, cooperate, and try new things. For Michelle, Camp Scott represented that opportunity. It was supposed to be a place where she could create memories. It was supposed to be a place where she could experience the excitement of being part of something larger than herself. The tragedy that followed did not only take away her life. It took away every future experience that should have come afterward. Doris Denise Milner, at 10 years old, was entering another stage of childhood. 10 years old is an age of transition. Children begin taking on more responsibility while still carrying the curiosity and imagination of younger years. Many children at this age start feeling more independent. They begin forming stronger opinions, developing deeper friendships, and imagining the future ahead of them. For Doris, camp was an opportunity to continue that growth. Like the other girls, she arrived expecting a positive experience. She arrived because adults believed it was the right place for her. She arrived because her family trusted that she would be safe. That trust is one of the central themes of the entire case. The tragedy at Camp Scott was devastating not only because of what happened, but because of where it happened. It happened in a place created for children. A place where families believed their daughters would be protected. A place where safety was supposed to be part of the experience. As the investigation unfolded, the focus naturally turned toward questions. Who entered the camp? Who had access to the area? What evidence could explain what happened? Could the person responsible be identified? Those questions drove the investigation for years. But behind every question was the same reality: 3 children were gone. The evidence collected from the scene represented more than a criminal investigation. Each piece represented an attempt to understand the final moments of 3 lives. Investigators were not simply trying to solve a mystery. They were trying to provide answers to families who had lost everything. The years after the murders brought attention, speculation, and debate. The case became known across the United States. The suspect, the trial, and the forensic evidence became subjects of discussion. But fame did not make the loss easier. A nationally recognized case is still a personal tragedy for those closest to it. A newspaper headline does not capture the experience of losing a child. A courtroom does not capture the emptiness left behind. A police report cannot describe the full life of the person who is no longer there. That is why victim stories matter. They return the focus to the people at the center of the tragedy. Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner went to Camp Scott because they were children who wanted to experience something new. They were not part of a mystery. They were not part of a historical case. They were simply 3 young girls beginning a summer adventure. Their story deserves to be remembered not only because of how their lives ended, but because of how they lived before that moment. They were daughters. They were friends. They were children with futures ahead of them. The tragedy at Camp Scott took those futures away, but it did not erase the importance of the lives they had already lived. And as investigators later walked through the camp, examining evidence and searching for answers, they were ultimately trying to uncover the truth behind one question. How could a place built for childhood memories become the scene of a crime that would haunt America for generations? The night of June 12, 1977, began as a night like many others at Camp Scott. The sun disappeared beyond the wooded landscape of northeastern Oklahoma, leaving behind the quiet atmosphere that comes with a summer evening in the countryside. The activities of the day were over. The energy of hundreds of children slowly settled into the calmer rhythm of nighttime. Conversations became quieter. Footsteps became less frequent. The camp moved from activity into rest. For the campers, it was the end of their first day in a new environment. For the counselors, it was another night of responsibility. For the families waiting at home, it was a night when they believed their daughters were safe. No one knew that the hours ahead would become the defining moment of the entire Camp Scott story. The girls who had arrived expecting adventure were preparing to sleep inside their tents, surrounded by the unfamiliar but exciting sounds of the outdoors. The forest around them continued its natural nighttime routine. The trees stood quietly around the camp. The darkness covered the landscape. The distance between different areas of the camp became harder to judge as visibility disappeared. To everyone inside Camp Scott, the night appeared ordinary. But somewhere during those dark hours, that ordinary night ended. The exact sequence of events during the early morning hours remains one of the most important unanswered parts of the case. Investigators would later determine that Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner had been taken from their tent during the night. The girls were found a short distance away from where they had been sleeping. The crime scene indicated that they had suffered violent deaths. The discovery shocked everyone connected to the camp. A place associated with children, friendship, and outdoor learning had become the location of an unimaginable crime. The contrast was devastating. Only hours earlier, the area had been filled with the normal sounds of a summer camp. Children had been participating in activities. Counselors had been carrying out their duties. The environment was supposed to represent safety and trust. Now, investigators were facing one of the most difficult questions in any homicide investigation. How could this happen without anyone knowing? The circumstances of the crime created immediate challenges for investigators. Camp Scott was not a controlled indoor location. It was a large outdoor environment surrounded by woods. The passage of time, weather conditions, and the natural movement of people and animals could affect physical evidence. Investigators had to reconstruct events from what remained. They needed to determine where the girls had been taken. They needed to understand how the person responsible moved through the area. They needed to identify what evidence could reveal the truth. Every detail mattered. The position of objects. The condition of the area. The traces left behind. The statements of those who had been present. In a case where there were no surviving witnesses to the crime itself, investigators had to allow the evidence to tell the story. The murders immediately created fear and disbelief. For the campers and staff members who remained at Camp Scott, the reality of what had happened was overwhelming. A place that had represented excitement and independence suddenly became associated with danger. The emotional impact extended beyond the camp. Parents across the country who had trusted summer programs began questioning their own assumptions. If something so terrible could happen at a respected children's camp, what did safety truly mean? The case challenged a belief many people held at the time, that certain places were naturally protected because they were created for children. Camp Scott demonstrated that safety was not guaranteed simply because a location had a positive purpose. Protection required preparation. It required awareness. It required constant attention. As news of the murders spread, the public reaction was intense. The idea that 3 young girls could be killed while attending a summer camp was difficult for many people to accept. The case quickly became more than a local investigation. It became a national story. Reporters arrived. Law enforcement agencies became involved. The search for answers began. But before investigators could identify suspects or examine evidence, they first had to understand the scene itself. The woods around Camp Scott became the focus of careful examination. What had once been ordinary ground beneath trees became a place where investigators searched for clues. Footprints, physical evidence, and any possible trace left behind could potentially reveal what happened during those hours of darkness. The investigation was no longer about what people believed had happened. It was about proving what actually happened. One of the most disturbing aspects of the case was the vulnerability of the victims. The girls were children sleeping in a place where they were expected to be protected. They were not involved in dangerous situations. They were not aware of any threat. They were simply sleeping. That reality is what made the crime so deeply unsettling. The victims were among the most vulnerable members of society, and the location was one where parents believed their children were being cared for. The tragedy forced many people to confront an uncomfortable truth: danger can sometimes appear in places where people least expect it. The hours between the girls going to sleep and their discovery the following morning remain the central mystery of the case. What happened inside and around the tent? How did the person responsible approach the area? Why did no one intervene? What evidence could reveal the identity of the killer? These questions would shape the investigation that followed. Over the coming months, detectives would pursue leads, examine suspects, and analyze evidence. They would eventually focus heavily on one man, Jean Leroy Hart, an escaped convict who had been living in the surrounding area and whose background made him a significant person of interest. But before that investigation unfolded, there was only the scene itself. A quiet camp. A dark forest. 3 children who would never wake up. And a community struggling to understand how such a tragedy could happen. The morning after June 12, 1977, Camp Scott was no longer simply a summer camp in Oklahoma. It had become the beginning of a search for justice that would continue for decades. The most difficult moments in any true crime investigation are often the ones investigators can never fully reconstruct. There are moments when evidence provides answers. There are moments when witnesses provide clarity. But there are also moments when the truth remains hidden behind darkness, time, and uncertainty. For the Girl Scout murders, the night of June 12 into the early morning hours of June 13, 1977, remains the central unanswered chapter. Investigators could determine certain facts from the physical evidence left behind, but the exact sequence of events inside the quiet woods of Camp Scott has never been completely known. What is known is that sometime after the campers went to sleep, Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner were taken from their tent. The girls who had arrived at Camp Scott expecting a week of outdoor activities and friendship became the victims of a crime that would shock an entire nation. The first night of a camping trip is often remembered for its small details. Children adjusting to sleeping outdoors. The unfamiliar feeling of a sleeping bag beneath them. The sounds of other campers nearby. The excitement of knowing that the next morning would bring new activities. For the girls in the Kiowa unit, the night should have been the beginning of a summer experience. Instead, sometime during those hours when the camp was quiet, their lives were taken. The details of the crime scene later revealed the violence that occurred. Investigators determined that the girls had suffered physical injuries and that their deaths were caused by strangulation or asphyxiation. 2 of the victims showed evidence of sexual assault, while the examination of the third did not indicate the same findings. These facts became part of the official investigation. They also became part of the reason the case received such intense attention. The crime was not only tragic because of the victims' ages. It was devastating because of the circumstances surrounding it. The girls were in a location where they were expected to be safe, under the care of an organized youth program, surrounded by people who believed they were protected. The violation of that trust created a lasting impact. As investigators examined the scene, one of their greatest challenges was understanding movement. A person had entered the area. A person had reached the girls. A person had left behind evidence. But who was that person? And how had they moved through the camp without being detected? Outdoor crime scenes are complicated because they do not have the same boundaries as indoor locations. A room has walls. A building has entrances and exits. A forest does not. The surrounding woods provided many possible routes. The darkness provided concealment. The distance between tents created uncertainty. Investigators had to consider every possibility. Someone familiar with the area. Someone passing through. Someone who knew the camp's layout. Someone who had planned the crime. Every possibility required examination. The discovery of the victims created an immediate emergency response. The normal routine of Camp Scott stopped. The activities planned for the day no longer mattered. The focus shifted completely toward understanding what had happened. Law enforcement officers entered an environment that only hours earlier had been filled with children and counselors. They began documenting the scene, collecting evidence, and attempting to preserve anything that could identify the person responsible. The investigation required patience. The answers were not obvious. There was no immediate confession. No eyewitness who could explain every moment. No single piece of evidence that instantly revealed the truth. Instead, detectives had to build a case from fragments. A footprint. A physical trace. A statement from a witness. A possible connection. In homicide investigations, especially those involving unknown offenders, the smallest details can become important. A single overlooked piece of evidence can change the direction of an entire investigation. At Camp Scott, investigators searched for those details. As news spread, the community experienced a mixture of grief and fear. Parents wondered how such a crime could happen. Camp organizers faced questions about security and responsibility. Residents of the surrounding area questioned whether the person responsible was still nearby. The fear was intensified by the fact that the killer was unknown. An identified suspect creates one kind of fear. An unidentified suspect creates another. When people do not know who committed a crime, they begin searching for possibilities. They examine strangers. They reconsider familiar places. They wonder whether the person responsible could be someone they passed on the street or someone who lived nearby. That uncertainty affected the community surrounding Camp Scott. The investigation would eventually focus on Jean Leroy Hart, a man whose history made him a major suspect. Hart was an escaped convict with previous convictions involving kidnapping and sexual assault. At the time of the murders, he had been hiding in the area near Camp Scott. For investigators and many members of the public, those circumstances appeared significant. But a criminal investigation must move beyond suspicion. A person's past, even a troubling one, does not by itself prove responsibility for a separate crime. That distinction would become one of the central issues of the case. The prosecution would later argue that the evidence connected Hart to the murders. The defense would argue that the evidence was insufficient. The jury would ultimately have to decide whether the state had proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Before the courtroom debates began, however, there was only the tragedy itself. 3 families waiting for answers. A community searching for understanding. Investigators facing one of the most challenging cases of their careers. And a question that seemed impossible to ignore. Who entered Camp Scott that night? The answer would lead authorities on a long investigation involving searches through wooded areas, interviews with witnesses, examination of physical evidence, and a manhunt for one of Oklahoma's most wanted fugitives. But even after years of investigation, the complete truth remained out of reach. The night at Camp Scott became more than a crime scene. It became a mystery. A mystery built from evidence, uncertainty, and the memory of 3 young girls whose lives ended during what should have been an ordinary summer night. And as investigators began their search for the person responsible, they would discover that the path to justice would be far more complicated than anyone expected. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds an unsolved crime. It is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of answers. For the Girl Scout murders, that silence begins in the hours after the campers went to sleep on June 12, 1977. Somewhere between the end of the evening activities and the moment the victims were discovered the following morning, a series of events unfolded that investigators would spend decades trying to reconstruct. The physical evidence would reveal pieces of the story. The investigation would reveal possible explanations. The courtroom would examine arguments from both sides. But the complete picture of what happened during those dark hours has never been fully established. That uncertainty is one of the reasons the case continues to draw attention. It is a story where the beginning and the ending are known, but the middle remains filled with unanswered questions. At Camp Scott, the night began with the ordinary routines of a summer camp. Children prepared to sleep. Counselors carried out their responsibilities. The excitement of the first day gradually gave way to exhaustion. For many campers, the first night away from home carried a mixture of emotions. There was excitement about being somewhere new, but there was also the unfamiliar experience of sleeping in a different environment. The sounds of the outdoors replaced the familiar noises of home. The forest surrounded them. The darkness covered the camp. The night continued. For Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner, that should have been only the beginning of their week at Camp Scott. They should have awakened the next morning. They should have continued participating in activities. They should have returned home with stories about their summer adventure. Instead, their tent became the center of a homicide investigation. The discovery of the girls changed everything. A place designed for children immediately became a place where investigators searched for answers. The camp's normal rhythm disappeared. The activities that had been planned were replaced by police investigations, interviews, and forensic examinations. Every part of the scene had to be carefully considered. Where had the girls been sleeping? Where were they found? What had happened between those two locations? What traces had been left behind? In a case without a surviving eyewitness to the crime itself, investigators had to rely on evidence to reconstruct events. The scene became a silent witness. The physical evidence indicated that the crime was violent. Investigators determined that the girls had been assaulted and killed during the night. The details of their deaths revealed the seriousness of the attack and confirmed that the person responsible had shown extreme violence toward vulnerable victims. The medical examinations became an important part of the investigation. They helped authorities understand what had occurred and provided information that would later be presented during legal proceedings. But forensic evidence can answer only certain questions. It can show what happened. It can sometimes show when something happened. It can sometimes connect a person to a crime. But it cannot always explain why. And in this case, the question of why remained as painful as the question of who. One of the most troubling aspects of the crime was the apparent absence of immediate detection. The camp was not empty. Other children were nearby. Counselors were present. Yet the attack occurred during the night without anyone stopping it. This became a major focus of public discussion. People wondered how the person responsible had entered the area, reached the tent, and left without being discovered. The answers depended on understanding the environment. Camp Scott was surrounded by wilderness. The layout included wooded areas and spaces where movement could occur without being easily visible. At night, the conditions changed dramatically. Distances became harder to judge, and sounds could blend into the natural background of the forest. A person moving quietly through such an environment might not immediately attract attention. That possibility became part of the investigation. As detectives worked to understand the crime, they also examined whether there had been warning signs before the murders. One of the most unusual details connected to the case involved a small structure found in the woods near the camp before the killings. Inside were items that later appeared deeply concerning, including materials that investigators considered potentially connected to a planned attack. Questions emerged about whether this discovery had been an overlooked warning. Could the crime have been prevented? Was there information available before the murders that should have been taken more seriously? These questions became part of the broader examination of the tragedy and contributed to later discussions about safety procedures at children's camps. However, the existence of suspicious circumstances does not automatically establish who committed a crime. Investigators still needed evidence that could identify a specific person. That search would become the central challenge. As the investigation expanded, attention turned toward the possibility that the person responsible was familiar with the surrounding area. The location of Camp Scott became important. Someone who knew the terrain might have had advantages over someone unfamiliar with the environment. Someone familiar with the area could potentially move through the woods more easily, understand access routes, and avoid detection. These considerations eventually led investigators toward Jean Leroy Hart. Hart's background immediately attracted attention. He was an escaped prisoner. He had a criminal history involving serious offenses. He had been hiding in the region near Camp Scott. To many investigators, those facts made him a person who required close examination. But the transition from suspect to convicted criminal requires evidence. That distinction would define the years that followed. The tragedy at Camp Scott created a need for answers that extended beyond law enforcement. Families needed the truth. The community needed reassurance. The public wanted to understand how such an event could happen. But the investigation moved into a difficult territory where evidence, assumptions, and uncertainty collided. The person responsible had left behind clues. But were those clues enough? The investigators believed they were following the right path. The defense would later argue otherwise. And years after the murders, a courtroom would be asked to decide whether the evidence told a clear enough story. Before that moment arrived, however, detectives had to navigate months of searching, questioning, and uncertainty. They had to follow every lead. Examine every possibility. Separate fact from rumor. And attempt to answer the question that had haunted Camp Scott since that morning. Who was responsible for taking 3 young girls from a place where they were supposed to be safe? The search for that answer had only just begun. The morning of June 13, 1977, began with a routine that should have been completely ordinary. At Camp Scott, another summer day was supposed to begin. Children should have been waking up inside their tents, preparing for breakfast, talking about the activities ahead, and sharing the excitement that comes with being away from home. Counselors should have been organizing schedules, checking on campers, and guiding another day of outdoor experiences. Instead, the morning brought a discovery that transformed the entire camp. The quiet of the forest was broken not by the sounds of children preparing for the day, but by confusion, fear, and disbelief. Somewhere during the night, 3 girls had disappeared from the world of childhood and entered the pages of a criminal investigation. The discovery of Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner marked the moment when Camp Scott changed forever. The girls were found away from the tent where they had been sleeping. Their bodies were located in a wooded area approximately 100 to 150 yards from their campsite. The distance was significant. It meant that whatever had happened during the night had involved movement away from the sleeping area. Investigators would later study that distance carefully, trying to understand how the person responsible could have moved through the camp and into the surrounding woods. The location raised immediate questions. Why were the girls taken from the tent? Why were they moved? How much time had passed between the attack and the discovery? What route had been taken through the camp? At that moment, however, those questions had no answers. There was only the devastating reality of what had been found. For those at Camp Scott, the discovery was impossible to comprehend. A place that had been filled with excitement only hours earlier suddenly became a scene of unimaginable tragedy. Counselors who had arrived expecting another normal morning were faced with a situation far beyond anything they had prepared for. Campers who had come for friendship and adventure were suddenly surrounded by fear and uncertainty. The emotional impact was immediate. The camp was no longer simply a place where children stayed during summer vacation. It had become a crime scene. Every movement mattered. Every object mattered. Every detail could potentially provide an answer. When law enforcement arrived, they faced the difficult task of preserving and examining an outdoor scene. Unlike a building with walls and controlled conditions, a forest presents unique challenges. The environment is constantly changing. Weather, animals, and human movement can affect evidence. Time becomes an enemy. Investigators had to work carefully. They documented the area. They collected physical evidence. They examined the surroundings. They attempted to reconstruct what had happened during the hours when the camp was asleep. The scene itself became a puzzle. Each piece of evidence represented a possible part of the story. A footprint could suggest movement. A mark could indicate contact. A piece of material could reveal a connection. A trace left behind could become the link between the crime and the person responsible. Among the evidence collected were several types of physical clues that would later become central to the investigation. Investigators recovered footprints and examined impressions left in the area. They looked at tire marks that could potentially indicate vehicles connected to the crime. They collected biological material, including hair and bodily fluids, which would later be examined using the forensic methods available at the time and, decades later, through advances in DNA technology. In 1977, forensic science was far less advanced than it is today. DNA profiling did not yet exist as a standard investigative tool. Investigators could not compare genetic material in the way modern detectives can. Evidence that might provide a definitive answer today could only provide limited information at the time. This limitation would become one of the most important factors in understanding why the case remained unresolved. As detectives examined the scene, they also learned about a troubling discovery made before the murders. Shortly before the tragedy, someone connected to the camp had found a small shelter or structure in the surrounding woods. Inside were items that appeared unusual and disturbing, including rope, tape, photographs of girls, and a written message containing threatening language. The discovery raised serious questions. Had someone been preparing for an attack? Was this connected to what happened later? Could recognizing the warning signs earlier have changed the outcome? These questions would continue to be debated for years. The existence of the shelter and its contents became one of the most discussed aspects of the case because it suggested that there may have been signs of danger before the murders occurred. However, connecting those items directly to the crime required evidence. Suspicion alone could not identify the person responsible. As news spread beyond Camp Scott, the investigation became a national story. The public reaction was intense because the victims were children and the location was a place associated with safety. Parents across the country imagined their own children in similar circumstances. They imagined saying goodbye before summer camp. They imagined trusting others to care for their daughters. They imagined receiving a phone call that changed everything. The case created a widespread sense of vulnerability. It challenged the assumption that certain environments were naturally protected. For investigators, the first hours and days after the discovery were critical. They needed to preserve evidence before it disappeared. They needed to identify everyone who had been in or near the area. They needed to determine whether the killer was someone connected to the camp or someone who entered from outside. Every person became a potential source of information. Every timeline became important. Every possibility had to be considered. The investigation could not rely on emotion, public pressure, or assumptions. It had to rely on evidence. The discovery at Camp Scott was the beginning of a long and complicated search for the truth. The victims had been found. The crime was confirmed. But the most important question remained unanswered. Who had done this? The forest surrounding Camp Scott held the evidence investigators needed. But finding that evidence, understanding it, and proving what it meant would become a challenge that lasted for decades. Because in this case, the first discovery did not bring clarity. It created a mystery that would lead investigators toward one of the most controversial suspects in Oklahoma criminal history and begin a legal battle over what the evidence truly revealed. Once Camp Scott became an active crime scene, every detail of the surrounding area gained new importance. Before June 13, 1977, the woods surrounding the camp had been ordinary parts of the landscape. They were places where children walked, explored, and learned about nature. The trees, paths, and open spaces were part of the experience that made summer camp memorable. After the murders, those same areas became a map investigators had to decode. Every section of ground had a question attached to it. Where had someone entered? Where had someone walked? Where had someone stopped? Where had someone left behind evidence? The forest did not speak in words, but it contained traces of what had happened. The task of investigators was to understand those traces. The crime scene investigation at Camp Scott required a careful examination of both the victim's location and the surrounding area. The distance between the girls' tent and where they were found became one of the first important details. Investigators needed to understand the movement involved. The girls had not simply been attacked where they slept. They had been taken from the tent and found away from the original location. That fact suggested a series of actions had occurred during the night. Someone had entered the area. Someone had approached the tent. Someone had removed the girls. Someone had moved through the camp without being stopped. The physical evidence would be used to try to reconstruct that sequence. One of the challenges investigators faced was the nature of the environment itself. A wooded outdoor location is different from a traditional indoor crime scene. Inside a building, evidence may remain relatively contained. Walls, doors, and furniture create boundaries. At Camp Scott, the boundaries were much less clear. The forest extended in every direction. The ground contained natural disturbances. Weather could affect physical traces. People moving through the area could unintentionally alter the scene. This meant investigators had to work quickly while also being extremely careful. A footprint could disappear. A small object could be overlooked. A trace of evidence could become impossible to interpret if its original position was disturbed. The first responders and investigators were faced with the difficult balance between searching for answers and protecting the integrity of the scene. Among the evidence collected were footprints believed to be connected to the crime. Footwear impressions can sometimes provide important information in a criminal investigation. They can reveal movement, direction, and sometimes connect a suspect to a location. At Camp Scott, investigators examined footprints found in the area as they attempted to determine whether they belonged to the person responsible. However, like much of the evidence in this case, interpretation became a matter of debate. A footprint can show that someone was present. But proving exactly who left it can be far more difficult. The question was not simply whether a person had walked through the woods. The question was whether the evidence could identify the person who committed the murders. Investigators also examined tire tracks and possible vehicle evidence. Because Camp Scott was located in a rural area, access points and surrounding roads became important parts of the investigation. Authorities wanted to know whether someone had driven near the camp, whether a vehicle had been used before or after the crime, and whether any vehicle could be connected to a suspect. The surrounding area was searched carefully. Investigators looked for patterns. They looked for connections. They looked for anything that could narrow the possibilities. But again, the challenge remained the same. Evidence had to do more than raise questions. It had to provide answers. Biological evidence also played a major role in the investigation. Samples were collected from the crime scene, including materials that could potentially identify the person responsible. In 1977, however, the tools available to investigators were limited compared with modern forensic technology. DNA profiling, which would later transform criminal investigations around the world, was not yet available. This meant investigators had evidence that could be preserved but not fully analyzed in the way it might be today. Decades later, scientists would revisit some of these materials using advanced DNA methods. The hope was that technology unavailable in 1977 could finally provide the answer that investigators had been seeking. But the results did not produce the definitive identification many people hoped for. The evidence remained part of the mystery rather than the final solution. Perhaps one of the most unusual elements connected to the discovery involved a separate location found near Camp Scott before the murders. A small shelter or campsite in the woods had been discovered before the killings. Inside were objects that appeared disturbing in light of what later happened. Investigators learned that the location contained items including rope, tape, photographs of girls, and a threatening written message. After the murders, this discovery took on a new significance. People questioned whether it represented a warning sign, whether it showed planning, whether it was connected to the person responsible. The existence of the shelter became one of the most debated aspects of the case. It represented the possibility that clues had existed before the crime occurred. It also raised painful questions about whether more could have been done. However, criminal investigations require careful separation between suspicion and proof. An unusual discovery can be important. A disturbing object can raise concern. A possible connection can guide investigators. But none of these things alone can establish guilt. To solve a murder case, investigators must demonstrate a reliable connection between evidence and a specific person. That challenge would define the Camp Scott investigation. The authorities had a crime. They had evidence. They had a suspect who would later become the focus of the case. But they still needed to prove the connection. As investigators continued working, they began building a timeline. They interviewed people who had been at the camp. They examined the movements of individuals who may have had access to the area. They looked into anyone who could potentially have known the layout of Camp Scott or had reasons to be nearby. The process was slow. It required patience. And it required following every possible lead. In major investigations, the first days after a crime often produce a flood of information. Some leads are valuable. Others lead nowhere. Detectives must separate meaningful evidence from coincidence. At Camp Scott, that process would eventually lead them toward a man whose history made him stand out. A man who had escaped from prison. A man who had been hiding in the surrounding area. A man named Jean Leroy Hart. The discovery of the crime scene provided investigators with the beginning of a story. It showed that something terrible had happened. It provided clues about how the victims were taken and killed. It offered evidence that could potentially lead to the person responsible. But it did not provide the final answer. The woods around Camp Scott held pieces of the truth. The challenge was determining how those pieces fit together. And as detectives followed the trail left behind, the investigation moved closer toward the man who would become the central figure in the case. In the earliest hours of a homicide investigation, detectives often work with two very different realities at the same time. The first is what they know. The second is everything they do not. At Camp Scott, the list of unknowns was far longer than the list of confirmed facts. Investigators knew that 3 young girls had been killed. They knew the victims had been removed from their tent during the night. They knew the crime scene contained physical evidence. But beyond those facts, almost every major question remained unanswered. Who had entered the camp? How long had the offender been there? Was the attack planned in advance? Did the person know the layout of the camp? Had anyone unknowingly seen something important? Those questions became the foundation of the investigation. As detectives began interviewing campers, counselors, and staff members, they searched for even the smallest piece of information that might help establish a timeline. In investigations involving large groups of people, memory can be difficult to organize. Individuals remember different details. Some observations appear significant at first but later prove unrelated. Other details that seem ordinary can eventually become crucial. The challenge for investigators was determining which information mattered. Every interview had to be compared with others. Every timeline had to be checked. Every statement had to be considered alongside the physical evidence collected from the scene. This process required patience. The answers were unlikely to appear all at once. Instead, detectives hoped that individual pieces of information would gradually form a clearer picture. The physical evidence collected at Camp Scott became central to that effort. Footwear impressions, tire tracks, hair samples, biological material, and other traces recovered from the area were carefully documented. Each item represented a possibility. A possibility that someone had left behind something unique. A possibility that the offender had made a mistake. A possibility that science could identify the person responsible. At the time, however, investigators were limited by the forensic technology available in the late 1970s. Many of the techniques considered routine today simply did not exist. Evidence could be collected and preserved. It could be compared using the methods available. But investigators could not yet rely on DNA profiling to identify an unknown offender with the level of precision modern investigations often achieve. This limitation would shape the future of the case. Years later, advances in forensic science would allow authorities to revisit some of the preserved evidence, hoping that modern technology might finally answer questions left unresolved in 1977. The results, however, would prove less definitive than many had hoped. One aspect of the investigation that attracted considerable attention involved the suspicious shelter discovered in the woods before the murders. Its contents appeared alarming after the crime became known. Items such as rope, tape, photographs of girls, and a threatening written message suggested the possibility that someone had prepared the location in advance. Investigators naturally considered whether this discovery was connected to the murders. If it was, it might indicate planning. If it was not, it could represent an unrelated but disturbing coincidence. Determining which explanation was correct required evidence. The shelter itself could raise questions. It could not answer them. As the investigation continued, detectives also expanded their search beyond Camp Scott. They examined reports of individuals who might have been in the surrounding area. They reviewed information about known offenders. They considered whether someone familiar with the local terrain could have used the wooded landscape to approach and leave the camp. The geography of the area remained important. The camp's rural location meant there were multiple potential routes through nearby woods and roads. Investigators had to determine whether any of those routes connected to a specific suspect. Among the people examined was Jean Leroy Hart. Hart's criminal history and status as an escaped prisoner immediately distinguished him from many other individuals investigators considered. His known presence in the region also made him a significant focus of attention. But even a strong suspect must be supported by evidence capable of withstanding legal scrutiny. Investigators still faced the same challenge that had existed from the beginning. Could the available evidence establish who committed the murders? As days turned into weeks, public attention continued to grow. The case was no longer simply a local investigation. It became a national story. Newspaper readers followed developments. Television reports summarized new findings. Communities across the country watched for updates, hoping that authorities would identify and arrest the person responsible. Public attention can place enormous pressure on investigators. People naturally want quick answers after a crime of this magnitude. But homicide investigations do not always move quickly. Evidence must be examined carefully. Leads must be verified. Assumptions must be tested rather than accepted. The desire for certainty cannot replace the need for proof. For the families of Laurie Lee Farmer, Michelle Gouza, and Doris Denise Milner, every day without answers was another day of waiting. The investigation represented hope. Hope that the person responsible would be identified. Hope that evidence would provide clarity. Hope that the legal system would eventually deliver justice. That hope sustained the investigation through months of interviews, searches, forensic examinations, and growing public attention. Looking back today, the discovery phase of the Camp Scott investigation remains remarkable not because it immediately solved the crime, but because it preserved evidence that investigators believed might one day answer the questions they could not resolve at the time. Some of that evidence would later be re-examined using modern scientific methods. Some of it would continue to be debated. Some of it would remain open to interpretation. The crime scene provided investigators with clues. It did not provide certainty. And that distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation shifted from collecting evidence to identifying a suspect. The next stage of the case would take detectives beyond the boundaries of Camp Scott and into a search that centered on a man whose past, location, and criminal history placed him at the heart of one of the most closely watched homicide investigations in Oklahoma history.